can you tell Dave to stop ringing? Can you just tell him not to ring me for an hour? We're
Dave,
doing a podcast.
can you stop ringing Will? We're doing a meeting. Okay, says call him later if you want an update on the dog.
Okay. This is good content.
Yeah. So what are we talking about?
Well, I'll fire some questions at you and go from there, really. Anything that's off limits?
I'm an open book, mate.
We should probably tell the millions of viewers that you're also my brother.
My name is George Harper. I started riding a bike when I was 19, I think. I started racing a couple of months after that, just local races. I wasn't in the best mental space when I started. I kind of used it as a way to feel better and using it as therapy for me because I wasn't particularly happy. And I fell in love with how it made me feel. And then I guess naturally just went in the racing direction without really thinking about it. But yeah, I then went from there, started doing races and did pretty well. And,
how did your first race go?
First race, I opened up my sprint with about a kilometre to go, thinking that was the dumb thing. I was winning up until 50 meters to go, but then got caught. But yeah, it was Castle Coombe, Cat 4 Castle Coombe.
So started riding at 19, then went pretty quickly Continental, Pro Continental, winning Tour Series, plenty of podiums. What would you say your finest achievement on the bike was?
I think it was probably Tour of Langkawi. Although I messed up the last stage, I should have been fourth. Well, actually, I should have been third, but there was a little bit of cheating going on from other riders that I won't mention. But yeah, I should have been fourth in the end, but just made a stupid mistake on the last stage where the peloton split in the sprint and I was sixth in the end. But I was riding against some of the best climbers in the world at the time. So that was probably a highlight.
So how many years after starting racing was that?
That was probably 4 years into my racing.
And for the number lovers out there, in terms of your power profile, what were the highlights?
I think probably my 1 to 5 minutes was probably my most standout attribute. My 4-minute power to win the Tour Series hill climb was I think like 519 watts.
At what weight?
Mid 65 probably.
Knowing what you know now, what would you tell a 19-year-old blissfully ignorant, hairy-legged George? What advice would you give him, having been through the ranks and learned a lot?
I would say it's amazing to be committed, motivated, and driven to succeed. But I think trying to keep an element of perspective in what you're doing is really important. It is a great thing to strive for, and it is an amazing career, but it comes with a lot of hardships and a lot of sacrifices. I think balance is really important. A happy bike rider is definitely a better bike rider. If you make cycling so important to you that every success and every failure has such a dramatic effect on your mental health and the way you see yourself and validate yourself, then you're setting yourself up for quite a dangerous path. You can get yourself into a real hole. Cycling is one of the sports where even if you're talented and very good at what you do, there's a lot of variables. Losing is something you have to get used to. You take a lot of mental knocks in cycling compared to a lot of other sports. If you do make it your everything, it can take a very strong toll on the mind. I wish I just kind of saw it a little bit more for what it was, which was, just a sport that should be enjoyed. But I think for me, it was more than that. It was my identity.
I think you don't mind me saying that after 2016, after the success of Langkawi, you had a pretty cataclysmic mental, emotional, spiritual, physical breakdown. The wheels kind of came off in every sense of the word. With a little bit of hindsight, why do you think that happened?
I was very hard on myself. I wasn't achieving the results I was told I should be achieving. I think from quite early on in my cycling career, I was told by a few people that I could do very big things. And it started out very promisingly for me. And then I think gradually just was becoming more and more disappointing. And that's essentially just how I ended up feeling, just more and more disappointed in myself. I think that might stem from some other insecurities I had of not being worthy or whatever, but it was a very crippling thing for me. I think I got more and more burnt out, more and more tired, really struggled with the pressures of the sport. That was something I'd always struggled with, even from a child when I was running. I used to run a lot. I did very well in cross country, but I actually really hated the pressure of it. So I think I wasn't really equipped mentally to handle the pressures and the disappointments that cycling gives, I think, at the higher levels.
I think the advice you were giving young George was about perspective. When you were living in Girona and you were 60 kilos, maybe less, there was no kind of real social life at one point. You were just like legs up, even walking to the shop. You thought maybe you'd get too tired, like you weren't supposed to be walking. And I remember you told me that you were so hungry that you used to wake up in the night and even like a totally unsalted normal peanut just tasted like the most delicious thing in the world because you were just so hungry. So I'd be interested to hear your perspective on the food, weight, rest, obsession side of things.
Yeah, I mean, you end up living in a constant state of anxiety, which was what it was for me. You're constantly thinking about your goals and how to sort of be the best and what you need to do. So instead of living relaxed and happy, I was living very much crippled by anxiety, by my weight, what I was eating, how much I was walking, if I had to walk to the supermarket to get food or not. Yeah, it became ridiculous. Like, life quality was not good. And I think I'd never really been worried about my weight in cycling until we went Pro Conti level. I don't want to blame people, but I think people saw me as maybe a rider that I wasn't. So I was essentially convinced that maybe I was a climber. And I thought, well, to be a climber and compete with the best, I need to be as light as I possibly can be. So I went down that route, and that was really dangerous for me because I did get very obsessed with getting thinner. I was on the scales every morning, hoping to see a lower number, feeling really elated and almost high when I was, really low 60s. You lose all perspective. It's quite scary. I was definitely not in a good place. And I remember when I did allow myself to eat carbs, I'd have like a bowl of pasta. It kind of felt like a drug. It was a very strange feeling. A couple of months prior to getting really light, I was going really well, but then I went over the top, and that was at the beginning of the season, which wasn't ideal. Actually, after Langkawi, I was a good weight for Langkawi, sort of 65, which was essentially about as low as I should have gone. Any lower wasn't really sustainable. But yeah, I lost another 4 kilos, and I was just weak as anything.
Yeah, and I remember the advice you were getting from someone who was supposed to be the person you turn to for your training. I remember you guys being sent out on 6, or I even want to say 7-hour rides where you were only allowed to eat protein and you only had protein breakfast before. And I thought that is craziness. And what we know now in sports science, the damage that sort of thing can do, particularly for hormone maintenance, let alone the fact that there is zero conclusive research to say that you get any performance benefit from doing that. It was crazy to look on and see you doing that.
In One Pro Cycling, we were told to go out on 6-hour fat burn rides off avocado and eggs and black coffee, and every 2 hours have a black coffee to stimulate the metabolism.
It's bullshit. There's no science behind it. It's old school 1970s. It's devastating how people in positions of power can do that.
Yeah. For the first few years of my cycling career, I didn't have a coach. I very much listened to my body, rested when I was tired, and really enjoyed riding, really enjoyed the sensations, because I essentially I used my common sense, and I still believe it's the best I ever went. It's when I got a coach and I started getting pushed and really overloaded for what I feel like was the training load that suited my body. Everything went to shit, really. I had no zip in races. I didn't have that like hunger. I was just tired all the time. One of my biggest strengths, which was recovery, I could do a massive effort, recover in seconds, massive effort, recover in seconds. That part of my ability was just gone. The lactic acid would just stay in my legs. I was a very different rider. It was, yeah, all the things that were fun weren't fun anymore, basically, because I just felt always on the limit, always on tipping point. And we're told, oh, it's the process. Oh, that's where you need to be. That's where you have to be the best. But in my mind, that's not sustainable. I was always crying. I remember the beginning of that race. I woke up in the morning, tears, and my girlfriend at the time was like, well, you should maybe not race. And then I was like, oh no, I have to race. Anyway, but
Sorry, I keep talking over you. You were the color grey, and I remember thinking, Jesus, you just do not look like a healthy person. You look absolutely exhausted and malnourished, but still you raced. I think you ended up coming second, but the point is, you were naturally an incredibly gifted athlete, and you'd also got to such a high level of fitness that even when you were absolutely on the limit and exhausted, you could still go and win a national B just because your bottom line had risen so much. But when it gets to the top ranks or even national A's, being that exhausted, you just rarely ever see your full potential, and let alone the kind of psychological impacts it has on you. So
yeah,
I think the moral
no,
of the story is never get a coach. We should just end the podcast there.
I definitely didn't have the right coach, and like you said, I was very impressionable at the time, so I took everything he was saying like gospel. I think that was my biggest mistake. I put my hands up there. Ultimately, I'm still in control of my decisions and my actions. I wish I did have a little bit more insight. If I were to go back in time, I would have definitely not gone down that route.
Mm.
I was crying daily on training rides because I was so exhausted trying to do what was planned for me. So I once did a 3-hour training ride. I didn't sit down in the saddle once for 3 hours because my saddle sores were so bad I couldn't sit without it bringing literally tears to my eyes. But I had to get the training done, so I did it out the saddle.
I think it was also around the same time where you were obsessing about your mattress. Like, I can't sleep on this one. I can't sleep on that one. I got to sleep downstairs. I got to sleep upstairs. If I just have this, if it's just this temperature, I think you were basically losing your mind. You were so unbelievably run down and anxious. The fact is, you weren't sleeping particularly well because you were just incredibly hungry, but restricting intentionally. And you were just, I think you were on the precipice of your breakdown there. And yeah, you're obsessing about saddles, cycling shorts, everything.
Yeah, I was that period in particular. I was suffering from insomnia badly. I was getting about 1 hour's sleep a night, and then having to get up and train. And I was in that state for quite a few months. That was at its worst. But to be honest, for the entire 3 years that I was being sort of coached to this degree of training, I honestly didn't get a proper night's sleep. Probably in 3 years, everything was so restless. And the body's over the top. You just don't sleep well. You're always waking up. You're never really falling into a deep sleep. I was sleeping like years. And then obviously the pinnacle was when the insomnia really kicked in and I literally wouldn't be able to fall asleep. And then, like you said, I was obsessing about mattresses, telling my girlfriend at the time that I couldn't share a bed with her because if she moved, I'd freak out. The whole thing it makes me sound completely mental, but actually I'm not. I just got myself into a very dark state, and then the depression kicked in big time, and it was all pretty rough after that. Wheels came off big time.
For sure. And I think in terms of the training side of things, now I look back at it and I see while that training might have worked quite well for your guys who had been riding since they were kids, they had that years and years of endurance. They had those really solid foundations. That load might have been okay. The fact is, you needed to be treated as someone who was still very new to the sport, probably having to do more than a junior does, of course, because you're out going racing Tour of Langkawi, but definitely not slamming you with the amount of training that you would give really experienced team members, and I don't feel there was any accommodation of that quite important nuance in your training. And I wonder whether you could talk a bit about coming back to the sport after the breakdown, after I think quite a lot of help, medication, things like that. Where was your head at in the immediate sort of aftermath of the breakdown?
Well, I came back with a lot more perspective because the reality is when I did have my breakdown, I was very much questioning my life, whether I wanted to live. I was very suicidal for a long time. And obviously that's pretty much the darkest place you can be without being dead, I guess. I think after going through that, I had a very different outlook on life. I remember being a bit more chippy to management afterwards, like on, you know, if I wasn't happy with something, I would be a bit better at stating it and having a little bit more confidence in myself. I was obviously still very messed up from everything that had happened before, but I do remember coming into it with a very different mindset. It wasn't so life and death type mindset. I remember I got a lot of help. I got medication, and I think that really helped pull me out of the darkness and see a little bit more clearly on the importance of it all. So I stuck it up. I gave it another shot for a year, and I was heavier. Like the thing is, after my mental breakdown, I did come back heavier. I was high 60s, and for the tour series, that was good. I was actually one of the strongest that year. But yeah, for the hillier stuff, a little bit overweight, so I wasn't great. But yeah, honestly, I didn't really care at that point. I'd gone through so much shit in my mind that I didn't really care. It was a weird time, actually.
I had to sort of stop myself from laughing because you were obviously making a very sincere point. But when you said a bit overweight and not great on the climbs, I just remember obviously we were both on One Pro Cycling that year. And I remember they did a bit of like a media story around the first National A, which was what that one up north near
Oh
where
God, yeah. What was that?
what's it called? I can't remember what it was called. It has that like savage climb kind of up onto the moor or whatever it is. And
Yeah.
Watford did a load of like Will Harper, George Harper going to be the brothers racing shoulder to shoulder stuff.
Oh,
Both of us just spat first lap, first climb at the same time.
yeah. We both got dispatched right at the beginning. There's a great picture of us going over the top.
And do you think you loved riding the bike?
When I was broken for those few years, it wasn't enjoyable. No way. It was a job. I guess it felt like a job and a very hard one at the time. I think things do slightly change, and they when you feel like you're doing it as a job and you have to do it, does slightly change the mindset towards riding, but it should still be enjoyable to a degree.
So you were racing some of the best guys in the world at the time, doing some big Belgium one-day races where you'd come into the finishing straight in a massive peloton, shoulder to shoulder, with Quick Step leading it out. How did you feel when you were amongst that?
I had a lot of fear. Although I knew I could be there physically, I was scared. I would always be having a borderline panic attack. I remember in Belgium, this was pretty early on, I was in the lead break in a Pro Commerce with some pretty legit famous riders. We were within the last few K, and there's 6 of us basically going to the line for sure. And I just got completely convinced that I was having a heart attack, and I had to pull off on the side of the road, literally as this race was winding up for the win. I was physically, I was feeling really strong, but I got so anxious and I was so convinced I was having a heart attack that I had to pull over, and I was just a state, basically, having a panic attack on the side of the road. I found those scenarios pretty scary. I didn't deal with the whole big bunch thing very well. I preferred the races where it was hard and strung out and we were kind of just battling in smaller groups.
I think when we started the conversation, you talked about you were very, very good at athletics and cross country. But I remember having to go and, when we were much younger, like 7, 8 years old or whatever, go and find you in your hiding place because you were so terrified before races and drag you onto the track. And you'd always go and win and break a record and whatever else. But you were absolutely terrified. And it sounds like that fear was still there 15 years later at the end of a pro commerce. So I wonder if you ever worked out where that all came from.
It's weird because I didn't I didn't have the fear earlier on in my career in cycling. It was something that developed. In the beginning, I was excited and also I was ignorant to the sport. There was no pressure on anything. But then as it became serious and there were expectations from others, the whole fear of failing and all that inadequacy stuff reared its head, especially when I was a lot more tired. You know, these thoughts are a lot harder to keep at bay when you're exhausted all the time. So I think I had a fundamental lack of confidence in my ability. Always, that was with me. Unless I was winning, that would be the only thing that would relieve me from that for just a few days, probably. But other than that, whenever it came to crunch time, I would always have this slight panic and anxiety of whether I was actually capable of doing what I needed to do. And I think that would always hold me back and mess me up, probably.
It's amazing how when your heart rate's at 180, 190, whatever it is, and every sense is just heightened, how quickly you can access that feeling of panic. I definitely had that. And then the panic makes you feel like you are not capable of doing what you need to do. I remember I had it at the end of Tour of Reservoir, day 2. It was almost 4,000 meters of climbing. It was a hilliest race we did. I was coming into the finish, and we were in a break, like 5 of us, and I just became terrified of opening my sprint up. I just assumed that my whole body was going to go into shock if I did anything. And then reflecting on it now, like, I think I had a very good chance of winning that race. I think I was a faster sprinter than everyone there. I actually ended up putting out quite good numbers, but like I opened my sprint up once everyone else was down the road. But yeah, I distinctly remember feeling an incredible surge of panic.
Yeah, no, I think that I had a lot of that. Instead of having the mindset of, right, you're strong, you should win this, you could win this, let's go. It's more like, if I go, I'm going to get beaten. And that mindset in itself, it has such a direct influence on your body. It is that shift from negative to positive that makes winners. You know, ultimately, everyone's probably in a very similar place, and it's the mindset that makes a huge difference in that. That's something I always lacked in those moments. I wasn't consistent. You know, I'd go through phases of thinking, oh, like, actually, I'm feeling pretty confident, feeling pretty good, and I'd do well for a bit. But I was emotionally very up and down. It was very hard to understand, probably, from like a coach's perspective at times. I wasn't like just your classic machine. I was a very emotional rider.
And then you hung your cleats up and decided enough's enough. And we're probably coming close to the end, but I just wondered whether you could give us a little bit of insight of how it felt to go from whatever it was, 5, 6 years of structure to the watt, to the minute, always on the go in terms of traveling around the world, racing, always having a target, always having something to think about, to ruminate over, always the next race, the next session, the next kilo, to boom, nothingness for a while. You just totally stopped. How was that?
Honestly, it was really probably the hardest phase of my life, and I think it's actually something I still struggle with today. I think going from having that identity, having that purpose, you know, it's very egotistical, the whole thing, but you feel like you're sort of onto something bigger. The spotlight's on you a little bit. You have crowds cheering for you, keen Belgian fans wanting to get your autograph, and all your friends are respecting what you're doing, and it's, you know, you feel like you're doing something special, which is really nice, and that becomes a really key part of your identity. And I was George the cyclist, and before I started riding a bike, I was very lost. I was doing a lot of drugs at a young age, drinking, just lost and not happy. And cycling gave me my identity, my direction. So I think leaving that again was really, really hard. I went traveling, and, you know, as cliche as it sounds, and I went to find myself. And still to this day, even when I do photography now and some video, but even when I have good moments in photography that I think a photographer should be proud of, it's like nothing compared to the sort of achievements that I used to be aiming for. You know, it's really hard to feel now like I'm doing something valuable with my life. You know, it's still a mindset that plagues me today, which is really strange. But I guess when you get so used to having aims like riding the Tour de France, winning a stage of the Tour de France, riding world championships, whatever, to going to shooting weddings, it's just a bit like living with a slight sense of failure. Still do. Still look back and think, fuck, what if I just like taken a break and got my head on straight and carried on like all of my teammates and friends were at the time, who are now on huge salaries and doing massive things. I think knowing I could be there is something that I still wake up with actually quite frequently, which is ridiculous because it's what, 6 years on now. But this is something that isn't spoken about enough in sport, and that's like the transition out of professional sport and the mental battle that comes with it. Getting back to normality, because it is not normal what you're trying to achieve in professional sport. So when you then go and try and have a more normal life, doing a more normal career, you can feel just a little bit lost. So in all honesty, I think I'm still there. I'm still feeling a little bit like that. But yeah.
Did you find you needed something else to replace that large void that was filled by cycling?
Yeah, I knew I had to get a new like obsession, so I went down the sort of surfing route. I kind of took myself off, became obsessed with the ocean and surfing, and I very much tried to create that as my kind of new identity, as something to give me motivation and something to aim for.
There was a lot of self-loathing about your time in the sport. Like you deleted every photo from Instagram that you ever had of you riding a bike.
Yeah.
There was a lot of there was a lot of pain there, a lot of blame, a lot of resentment.
Yeah, I was pretty ashamed of. Honestly, I had a lot of shame leaving the career, and a lot of resentment, a lot of anger. Hated that I didn't achieve what I should have. There would be days where I really felt like it was a waste of 6 years, and I wish I could get the time back. And I hate being bitter and twisted like that. And then I'd have days where I feel like I've kind of come out the other side, and I'm like, oh, actually, I did some pretty good things. Had got some achievements that you should definitely be proud of. But then for me, in my mind, it was like, it was never enough, not even close. So yeah, yeah. I don't know if I do wonder if I'll ever come to terms with it. That I didn't really do as well as I should have.
What would enough have been for you?
I'd won a big race or a stage of a grand tour or something, then I would always just want to go and win something else. So maybe the problem was in the mindset, but yeah, I guess to have my name up there on a big stage win or a big one day win, something like that, something I feel I was capable of for sure, but my mind let me down.
If there was no such thing as cycling fans, an audience, social media, anything like that, and you were winning a race and got zero plaudits for it, zero recognition, your parents didn't find out, your friends didn't find out, would it still have had the same attraction to you?
Probably not. I think a lot of it was validation for me. I think I probably wanted to be seen for being great at something to sort of validate my existence. What about you? Is that what drove you?
I'm asking the questions, big guy. Let me think about that one. I think where we probably diverge a little bit in our stories is that a massive amount of the reason for me doing it was a real addiction and obsession to, I had this feeling in me which just compelled me to keep going more forward. That's why every single season I had like a good few races and then burnt out, was in bed for a few months.
Yeah, that's definitely different, because before I started being coached, before like the professional world got a hold of me and kind of got into my mind, I definitely had a more relaxed approach to training and things. I wasn't as obsessive as you, definitely not. But yeah, I think that all changed when I got further into it. I kind of lost that element, which actually I think made me go better with having that slightly more chilled mindset. that I'd always want to go back that direction. But I think the battle I had is I was always told not to go back that direction. So I didn't do very well with having my, some riders really thrive on a training plan, and do really, really well. And other riders can be coached, but it needs to be understood that they have slightly different mindset to it and maybe something a bit more fluid.
I totally agree. I think you needed someone loving and compassionate and knowledgeable overseeing your training. I still think that, and I'm probably biased given you're my brother, but there's no one else I ever rode with who was, as strong as you on a training ride. No way. And I've ridden with a lot of great World Tour riders out here, and a lot of good riders over the time. And I think someone needed to recognize what a physiological talent you were and just think, fuck, don't break this. This needs to be handled with care. You had a hell of a lot of zip. You had a lot of top end. You had a lot of fast twitch muscle fiber, and you adapted so quickly. And while that can be great, that also means you go over the edge and down the other side much faster as well. I would have had you generally riding your bike with your friends, riding to the cafe. If you feel like hitting a Strava segment and you're not too close to a race, go for it. Garmin in the back pocket, like generally fun, and maybe giving you, days off in a row, 2-3 days off in a row quite frequently. It would say, go and live your life, go and be a surfer. But that's what you needed to make it sustainable for you and to really nurture and let that talent thrive, not to be under massive load doing 2x20s 3 times a week, building enormous amounts of CCL.
I think when I got onto the team, they saw my power pretty early on and thought, this guy's got impressive power. And then I think instead of doing what you said, where it's like, let's take care of this, it was more like, let's see what we can squeeze out of him. Yeah, like I remember in December or November, I was doing these 2x20s on the turbo, like 3 times a week, and doing 20-minute PBs indoors, and then going out and doing like 6 times 5 minutes full gas in the winter. Like, always there was so much full gas training. Everything was to the limit. I remember I had one training ride and my coach said, just go out and try and get every Strava segment there is. I think it was like, try and get 15-20 Stravas or something on climbs. And this was before the Tour of Britain. And I ended up going out and getting like 12 comms. but then, it was fucked for the Tour of Britain.
Back from the Tour of Britain.
I think I had 4 days easy after a 32-hour block of full gas efforts and long rides. Yeah.
And already under load, already in the middle of a big season. Yeah, it's quite amazing you actually made it as far as you did without having a monumental psychological breakdown.
I was minus 130 coming out of the Tour of Britain, something like that.
I think that's just classified as dead.
I think I remember needing like 9 or 10 espressos just to get off the bus to the start line in the morning. And at one stage, I completely forgot my cycling shoes.
Yeah, I think that's a story that did the rounds. I think someone it was probably Opie who told me he looked down and you were wearing your Nike Air Maxes or something. The starting motorbikes like pulling off the line in the Tour of Britain.
I was all over the shop.
It was quite funny. Well, I thought it was quite funny, but just when we were talking a few moments ago about doing it for kind of the plaudits and the recognition from other people and having kind of random Belgian people obsessed with you. I remember one race I did in Belgium, a guy came up to me with a rider card. And I thought, wow, I've made it. This is my moment. And he goes, can you sign this? And I looked at it and it was a picture of you. And I went, sorry, that's my brother. And he kind of looked at me, then looked the other way and he went, oh, I'll just sign it anyway. So it's like that was my one moment of fame. Cool. Well, I think we've done an hour of relatively nonsensical chat. So any final remarks to tell the sort of 3 people who might watch this? It almost seems like you haven't prepared for this interview.
Yeah, I was just launched into it. So it's all very much off the cuff. Yeah, I mean, it's probably a bit of a downer for people watching, to be honest. That pretty much summed up my career, sadly. But don't be disheartened by it. I came in absolutely loving it. I did love parts of it, and I think it's an amazing thing to be able to do. Just keep perspective.